Hello and welcome to another episode of the Crux of It. I hope you ladies are doing well and your loved ones too. And I really hope that you're enjoying the weather and managing to get out and about. So we had a great time on Monday night, those of us that were able to get together, and Lena led us in a study which was centered around John chapter 7. But just a bit of a recap, we had seen in chapter 6 that Jesus had done this amazing miracle feeding of 5,000 plus, and he fed them from a tiny pat lunch. And we see that actually Jesus had some really direct and hard words to say to the crowd and the religious leaders about what it meant to follow him or believe in him, and actually who he was. And we see as a result of that, there was a lot of mixed opinion about Jesus, and a lot of controversy had gone on based on some of the words that he had spoken to them. So now in chapter 7, what we see is that Jesus is actually wanting to go up to a particular feast. Now there was a feast that was taking place at that time, a special feast that the Jews celebrated, and that many Orthodox Jews today still celebrate. And it's called the Feast of Tabernacles, or some people know it as the Feast of Booths. And it was this feast that all Jews went to. And actually what we learn at the beginning of this chapter is that even Jesus's own brothers didn't really believe in him. They were a bit cynical about Jesus, and we read that they kind of said to him, well, why don't you go up to this feast and make your works known in public? I'm paraphrasing, you can read it, but that was kind of their response. But we're told that even they didn't believe in Jesus at that time, although their story does change later and they come to believe in him as God's Messiah. Now, what we also saw was that at that time, Jesus didn't go to the feast straight away, because the Jews, that is the religious leaders at the time in particular, were out to kill him because they didn't like his message and they weren't very happy with a lot of what Jesus had to say. Now, Lena did a great job in giving us some background around this Jewish festival. Now, I personally didn't really know much about it. I had heard about the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, but I never really understood what it meant. But the feast that was celebrated and is actually still celebrated today by Orthodox Jews was all centered around remembering a specific time in Jewish history. And it was a time when God had brought the children of Israel, that is Jewish people, out from slavery. So the background, the history of the Jews is that they had actually been oppressed in terrible slavery in Egypt, and God had delivered them, and God had promised them a new land that he would give to them. And as they left their slavery and their suffering in Egypt, they traveled along a wilderness. They traveled through a wilderness, a desert, in order to get to this new land that God had promised them. And this was a really tough journey. It was tough for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons it was tough is because the people really just kind of grumbled and complained a lot, and that set about a lot of things. And one of the things was that it delayed how long the journey should have actually taken. And believe it or not, this group of people ended up wandering around for 40 years in the wilderness, in the desert. And that was not just because of their grumbling and disobedience, but God had a very specific work that he wanted to do deep down in their hearts. Now, we're told that during that period, God really showed his faithfulness to the people of Israel. He provided water for them on 2 occasions out of a rock, which is miraculous. There were 2 occasions when they didn't have water and it was provided out of a rock. And this feast that the Jews even today still observe, like Orthodox Jews, is really a time of joy when they remember how God provided for them in the wilderness, and also just the importance of water to them, because, you know, agriculture is a really big part of life in Israel, and it was a really big part of life then. And, you know, they were dependent on the rains. Joanne was really sharing that with us. They were really dependent on the rains so that they could have enough harvest. So this festival was all about remembering God's faithfulness and giving thanks for the things that God had given them in order to have that abundance and that harvest. And, you know, they would really think a lot about water, and there was a lot to do with water at this particular festival. Now, in John chapter 7, we see many different things happening, but you could summarize the main things that we see as following. One, we see that that people are looking for Jesus, the crowd are looking for him, because obviously they've seen all the things that he said and he's done, and by that time he's become quite a well-known public figure. So people are looking for him and wanting to know what Jesus is going to do next and what he's going to say. So people are looking for him. Number two, we see that the Jewish leaders of the day are actually seeking to kill Jesus. So that's very clear in this chapter. Number three, we see that there's actually a division of opinion about Jesus and who he is, and there's a lot of confusion in the crowd. So that's another thing we pick up in this chapter. And number four, we see that there's an offer of life that Jesus gives again to the crowd, and he gives this on the very last day of the festival, which was the most important day of the festival. So we see these four things happening, but because of time, I just want to pick up on the last two things, which was the division of opinion about Jesus and also Jesus's offer of life. So, starting with the division of opinion about Jesus, there was just so many different thoughts and feelings and emotions in relation to Jesus. We're told that some of the crowd said, "Oh no, he's good," when they were looking for him at the start of the festival. So when the festival had started and people were looking for Jesus, the crowd were talking among themselves, and some people were saying, "No, he's a good man," and others were saying, "No, he's a deceiver and he deceives the people." Some other people said, and it was the leaders of the day, the Jewish leaders, they actually accused Jesus of being demon possessed. They said to Jesus, "You have a demon." And so there was a lot of mixture of opinion around Jesus. We're also told later on in the chapter that some of the people, they said, "Look, when the Messiah comes, will he do more miracles than this man has done?" They're like, truly, this is the prophet, the Messiah that we've been waiting for. And we're told actually in John chapter 7 that many people believed on him at this particular feast because of some of the things that he said. And we'll talk a little bit later about one of the things in particular. And so we see that there's this real mixture of opinion about who Jesus is. And what happens is that there's almost like a division of opinion we see happening in the crowd at that time. And we were discussing this in the Bible study, and we were saying actually this is what is happening now. There is a division of opinion about who Jesus is, what he came to do. And I think at this point it's really helpful just to ask ourselves some questions. So questions such as, okay, who do I say Jesus is? Now, it's quite interesting that we see on a particular occasion in the Bible that Jesus turned to his disciples and he said to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And we see that some of the disciples, they say, "Well, some people say that you're one of the prophets that was of old that's come back to life, or some people think you're this person." But actually, some of them say, "Well, actually, some people would say you're the Messiah." And Jesus asked them very pointedly, "But who is it you say I am?" And I think that's a question that Jesus would be asking each one of us today. Who is it that you say that I am? So that's a really good question for us to consider. And then also a question for us to consider is, if we're on that side with the crowd that would say he's a deceiver and he deceives the people, because there were people who thought like that, then a good question to consider is, where did Jesus get his teachings from? And are these teachings really from him? Are they just from himself, or are they truly from God? Is he a madman, or is he really who he says he is? And one of the scriptures that Jesus one of the things Jesus said during this feast that was recorded for us was this. It's in John chapter 7 verse 16, and Jesus answered them and said, "My teaching isn't mine, but it's from the one who sent me. If anyone wants to do his will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own." So what Jesus is saying, in short, is that anyone who wants to do the will of God and wants to really follow God will know deep down inside whether the things that Jesus is saying is true or not. And that's a decision that each and every one of us need to make at some point. And so I think these questions are really helpful, and I think as there was a division in the crowd then, there is certainly a division of opinion about Jesus now. Some people would even completely reject that Jesus ever even really lived on the earth, that he was actually a real man, although there are many even non-Christian sources that affirm that he was a real person that lived and walked upon the earth. So it's really just interesting for us to think about, who do we say Jesus is? Is he merely just a prophet or a good teacher from God, or is he really the Son of God as he says he is? So the final point I wanted to look at was Jesus' offer of life. Now, we're told that, actually we're told this in John chapter 7, verse 37, that on the last day of the great feast, Jesus stood up and he cried out saying, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. And he who believes in me, as the scriptures has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Now, this is really significant because one of the things that happened at this feast that Joanne was sharing with us was that there was that they would take water from a particular pool and they would pour it out on the stone pavement, and they were pouring out this water during this feast to remember how God gave them water in the desert. In the middle of nowhere, God met their needs he quenched their thirst and he brought water out of a rock. And water was also important during this festival because they remembered how God sent the rains and brought about the harvest. So water was a central theme in this verse, and we see Jesus standing up and making a parallel and saying, if anyone here is thirsty, come to me, and that, you know, he is going to quench their thirst. And not only is he going to do that, but out of their heart will flow a river of living water. Now, what does this actually mean? I don't know if any of you remember or familiar with the woman at the well that we spoke about some time back, the woman who had multiple relationships. And one of the things that we had seen is that this woman was thirsting for love or something in her life, but whatever had happened, it had gone wrong. And, you know, for some of us, you know, the truth is that we are thirsting, and not just some of us, I believe every one of us has a thirst in our life, and there's a deep need, a deep longing deep down inside. For some of us, it's that deep desire to be loved and to be cherished and to have someone just care for us. And for some of us, it's that need for affirmation. You know, we want people's approval and deep affirmation. For some of us, it could be success and wealth, that we want to be successful, and then we will feel like we've made it and we've made our mark on the world. And whatever it is, there's a thirst, there's a drive, there's a thirst for something. And Jesus is saying he is the only one that it will ever satisfy our thirst that we have. And when he satisfies that thirst that we have deep within us, that actually what happens is it produces a well, like a well of living water. And he's saying that's what happens to those that come to him and put their trust in him and believe in him, is that it doesn't just stop at them believing, but what happens is this well of life comes out. And what happens is, you know, there's a change that takes place within us that is so deep that we are changed, even if our circumstances are not. And out of us comes this river of living water. And that means if we're in a difficult relationship, if there's been brokenness in our lives, you know, we begin to look at our circumstances differently. We begin to experience healing within ourselves and healing within our relationships. We begin to love our enemies. We begin to love those that have offended us. We begin to be able to be all that God has called us to be and to really know his love. And this kind of springs up in our life. And then what happens is a river goes out into different places, and what happens, it begins to touch other people's lives, and you begin to kind of give out of what you've received to others because you want them to experience this amazing thing of their thirst being met. So this is what I personally have taken from what Jesus was saying, but this was a key thing that Jesus said during the festival. And again, I have by no means done this chapter justice. I just wanted it to be a very quick overview. Please do read John chapter 7, and I hope that this has been helpful to someone. I hope you have a good week, and I really look forward to the time when I can see some of you face to face. Lots of love and God bless. Bye.